Hi, this is Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of the Contrarian. I am absolutely delighted to welcome to the Contrarian my former Washington Post colleague, a man who I have immense respect for, Jason Rezaian. Jason, welcome.
Thanks, Jen. How are you?
I am good. You know, at the time that the Abrego Garcia matter kind of broke, I was thinking to myself, this isn't really all that different from a situation like yours. You were held by Iran under completely false pretenses from July 2014 all the way through January of 2016. The many, many others who have been held really hostage, Brittany Griner and others. And so I thought you'd be the perfect person to talk to about this phenomenon and how we should really look at it. So let me just start with a fundamental question. Do you consider the people who were removed, who were here legally, who were sent to El Salvador, are they hostages? Are they prisoners? What are they?
I think they're
How
both
should we think of it?
in some cases, right? I mean, I think they're all prisoners. Um, I think in the Abrego Garcia case in particular, now that the Trump administration, the U.S. government, and others have said it was a mistake to send him there, and that Bukele's not willing to send them back. We don't really know why, but probably, it's some fresh leverage for him in other negotiations with the United States. That's classic hostage situation, right? So whether or not this guy, had a great meeting and a beautiful meeting and, they're great friends, this man is now being held in an El Salvador prison, um, and presumably won't be released until the El Salvadorian government gets something in exchange. So that's a hostage. In
Um,
the other cases, I mean, I think um, we'd have to kind of unpack it a bit, but just the difficulty for me as someone who's such an advocate for repatriating and freeing American citizens and U.S. persons, green card holders, whoever, who are, detained unlawfully by foreign governments, so what I would call a state hostage taking, is that, here in the United States, Democrats and Republicans have invested heavily in bringing people home. People understand why this is important. And this sort of feels like the inverse of that, right? Banishing somebody that's not supposed to be banishing, sending them to a prison in a foreign country without any sort of um, judicial process or charges. Uh, it's irresponsible. It's I mean, mean-spirited is it doesn't even scratch the surface. And
right.
frankly, I think for people like you and me, qualifies as un-American.
Absolutely. Having had this experience before, and we don't know to what degree he and others have access to outside information, were you aware at some level that there was support for you or support for your family? And what difference did it make as you were sitting in prison in Iran?
Um, I don't know how many days it's been since he was deported and sent to that prison. I can tell you for the first month or more, I had no contact with anybody, including my wife, who was also being
Yes.
held in the same prison. So I had no awareness of efforts around my case. On the contrary, my captors told me that
Yeah.
not only was nobody doing anything for me, but that, the Washington Post had disavowed themselves of me because I never worked for them in the first place, and that it had been reported in the local media that my wife and I were killed in a car accident, and that cover story was accepted by everyone. So, the first time you hear something like that, you say, okay, that's far-fetched. But when you're being held in solitary confinement, in a cell that is, long enough, just barely, to lie down in one direction and not the other. And fluorescent lights are on 24 hours a day, and you're being interrogated relentlessly, and you have zero access to anything from the outside world. After a few days of that, you start to wonder, is that true? It took some months for me to grow an understanding of the efforts being made on my behalf. Um, and when I did come to understand that those were credible and real, it lifts your spirits, right? You can get through another day. It's like oxygen. It's like oxygen if you're being held underwater, right? And it made a massive difference. And I'll tell you, sadly, I was held for almost a year and a half. Um, that's sort of on the shorter end of one of these state hostage takings. And the more public advocacy, public awareness, typically the shorter the case. I mean, Brittany Griner and Evan Gershkovich, a little bit shorter than my imprisonment, just barely. But the vast majority of them drag out much longer.
Wow. So you have now been working with a think tank, CSIS, on this issue of hostage taking, which, as we were talking just before we went on, used to be a bipartisan thing. It's a good thing to bring Americans home. It's a bad
Yes.
thing to snatch Americans off the street and put them in hellish conditions. And in this bipartisan commission, you have reached certain conclusions. Can you talk to us a little bit about what those are and how, even in this bizarre situation where it's the United States government that is conspiring to hold him, that might be of some benefit in getting his return?
So, I look at the problem of hostage taking as something that the U.S. government has tried to address in earnest over the last decade, going back to the last couple years of the Obama administration. So at the time, the rise of ISIS in 2014, there were several very horrific murders on camera of Americans. The freelance journalist James Foley being the one that most people remember, and his mother, Diane Foley, became really the mother of hostage advocacy. And we in this space owe everything to um, the incredible dedication that she has put in on the heels of the most horrific thing that can happen to a parent, right? Um, and to their credit, the Obama administration recognized that they failed that family and several others and owned up to it, right? And Obama called for a review of hostage policy. And after that review was done in 2015, the the office of the special presidential envoy for hostage affairs was established. That uh, that that office has grown from one person doing the job part-time for the first 3 or 4 years of its existence to now, a full office of 40 something staffers at the State Department with a congressional mandate to repatriate Americans who are being held wrongfully around the world, both by states and by terrorist organizations, but also to cultivate deterrence tools. And I think for a long time there has been this belief um, that negotiating to free captive Americans will incentivize more hostage taking, so we shouldn't negotiate. And publicly, that has been our public leading policy. We don't negotiate with terrorists. But ultimately, anybody who's come home alive came home through a negotiated settlement. Our belief is that these are two imperatives that are connected, and they don't have a cause and effect sort of relationship. You got to bring people home as quickly and safely as possible. Use the resources available to do that. separately cultivate a cost to this behavior, right? But not on the backs of people who are currently being held, right? So we've come up with a series of recommendations that we're on the verge of unveiling, and I think, what I can say is, um, part of the problem is that governments that do it for different reasons, right? Iran does this, China does this, Venezuela, North Korea, Russia, right? These are the kind of main perpetrators. Myanmar, and the Syrian government until the fall of Assad, but also a few friendly governments as well. Turkey, um, Saudi Arabia. We've even had some cases in the Dominican Republic, right? So, but the reasoning is is different. Sometimes it's financial. In the case of Iran, they want to get assets that have been seized back. In the case of Russia, they want intelligence assets, spies who've been arrested. But what we're trying to do is sort of isolate, why is it that this adversary of ours is doing this? How can we get them to change that calculation? So that's kind of at the heart of what the recommendations will look like. But there's also a public component of this. Um, for lack of a better way of phrasing it, putting the fear of going to some of these places. Now, I can tell you, when I moved to Iran in 2009, I was well aware of the Islamic Republic of Iran's history of hostage taking, going back to 1979. But I took on that risk because I was a working journalist, and I wanted to help my readers understand this country that is, I would argue, very misunderstood because of a lack of access to it. I didn't think, though, that working there with full accreditation and, fully transparently, I would be subject to this kind of treatment. And now it's happening over and over again, and not just Americans. So, what we're trying to do is, first and foremost, bring people home safely, quickly. Two, make it less attractive for governments to keep doing this. And to those people who say that doing these deals to free hostages incentivizes more hostage taking, my response is no, it doesn't. They don't need to be incentivized. There's nothing standing in the way. There's nothing, that the U.S. government has or internationally, that politically we're willing to use. I mean, there are tools available. I've heard about the Magnitsky sanctions for global human rights offenders, and these are um, only credible in as much as we're willing to use them, right? And that's part of the problem. So some of the recommendations that we have include, um, you know, uh, pausing a country's foreign sovereign immunity around this particular issue, for certain tiers of countries that do this, but also incentives that if you were involved in this behavior and show a pattern of stopping it, we might lift some other sanctions that we have on you, right? Sanctions only work if there's a pathway away from them, right?
It's so interesting that you mentioned the Magnitsky Act. In the wake of that, and that, of course, was the statute that went into effect, largely because Magnitsky, who was the lawyer for Bill Browder, was
Yep.
imprisoned and killed in Russia, allows us to put sanctions on the people who do these things as a way of trying to separate them, create a disincentive for people to do the hostage and do the human rights abuses. In this case, this administration is arguably aiding and abetting this holding. But what about other countries? Could other countries that have similar Magnitsky Act provisions themselves begin to sanction El Salvador, or frankly, even the United States, if they perceive that this is a human rights abuse?
I think that they certainly could. I don't know that any other country is currently deporting people in this way to El Salvador. But yeah, I mean, I don't think that there's any reason that those sanctions would be off limits in these cases. And I think we have to look at that. I mean, frankly, Jen, I'm somebody who, when people in power say, "Our bad, we made a mistake," I want to take that at face value. I think they screwed this one up pretty bad,
Yeah,
right? And I
yeah,
think that they recognize it. And I don't think that they have a really credible pathway out of it.
yeah,
Which is why I am going to, and I hope you and many others will keep the pressure on so Abrego Garcia and others will come home, even if it comes at a tremendous cost to this government. Uh,
absolutely.
because
And that is something that we're trying at the Contrarian to really do. And so let me end with this. How important is it to keep public pressure on our government? They always say, well, we're doing everything we can. In this case, they're not doing everything they can. They're trying to block it. But in ordinary cases, does public pressure help either on the foreign government or our own?
we used to be in a situation, I think that the majority of countries around the world, um, even countries like Iran and Russia, when they would hold somebody, a strongly worded uh, letter of condemnation from a member of Congress in Middle America might be enough to open the prison door. Now, the condemnation is almost the point, right? Putin loves this. He loves to make an American president look weak, right? So, my attitude has often been you have to have a sort of ability to keep separate accounts of in your mind. Ultimately, the bad guy is the bad guy. It's the person who is holding our fellow citizen hostage. But that person is not going to get freed by some act of benevolence by Putin or the supreme leader in Iran or Kim Jong-il or Un or whoever, right? It's going to require the US president making a very tough decision, oftentimes against the better judgment and recommendations of the Department of Justice, right? And the US president can do that and has done that. So I think it's a delicate dance. And my brother, who was a very effective advocate on my behalf, I think came to understand this really well. He pushed very hard on the administration when people would ask him, did is the US government doing everything that they can, for you and your family? And he would say, no, they're not doing everything they can, because if they were, my brother would be sitting here next to me, right? Um, but I'll end with this. I asked our former publisher, Fred Ryan, who dealt with this problem, right? He inherited it. I had been in prison for just a few weeks when he took the job as the Post publisher, and I asked him some months after I was released what grade he would give the U.S. government. And he said, "Well, I have to give him a passing grade because you're home now, right?" And I think that's the benchmark, right? Don't leave people behind. Bring people home. It's going to happen faster in some cases than others. But my experience has been the more public pressure you put on U.S. administration, the more quickly it gets resolved, because they're not going to get involved until it becomes politically costly to ignore the problem.
Exactly. And that's exactly what we intend to do here. We're trying to encourage other outlets as well. I well remember the free Jason stickers that we had up in the offices. And of course, in Israel, we saw that the posters became a universal symbol of their determination to get those people out. That's the kind of action I think we are going to need in order to bring people like Kilmar Abrego Garcia home. So thank you so much for being with us, Jason.
Anytime.
And it's absolutely a pleasure. The work you're doing is heroic. And after the report comes out, we'll take a look. We'll be having you back, and
I'd love
you
it.
can take us
Can't
through
wait.
it.
Thanks,
We would
Jen.
love it. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.